The first time it happened, the mirrors moved before the people did. Hands rose in glass while bodies stayed still. Eyes blinked in silver. Mouths formed silent smiles that were not their own. By dawn, the attic was frozen. Heads tilted, fingers lifted, every gesture mirrored perfectly. Outside, the city continued unaware, but inside, life had surrendered. Weeks later, the mirrors were empty, yet the bodies remained, watching, waiting, obeying a law they had never consented to. And the ledger recorded it all, as if the house itself had learned to think. The first time it happened, the mirrors wept, though no water touched their silvered surfaces. A thin fog clung to the glass like a living thing, curling in impossible tendrils, snaking along frames, pooling in corners where floorboards met the beams, settling in the attic with a chill that penetrated through woolen stockings and thick velvet coats. Each mirror, dozens of them arranged with obsessive care, seemed to breathe under the candlelight, exhaling the damp, metallic scent of iron and old wood. Outside, the Neva flowed quietly beneath its thin sheet of ice, whispering to the frozen city, indifferent to the disturbances above. Yet inside the house, the air thickened, heavy with expectation, pressing against lungs and ribs, as if the walls themselves were aware of a secret that could not be spoken. Shadows elongated unnaturally, stretching along the beams, mingling with the fog until the forms of the mirrors multiplied, fracturing reflections into shards of impossible angles. A hand lifted in the reflection before its owner moved, a head tilted, brushing hair away that had yet to be disturbed, lips forming a silent word that would never be spoken aloud. Each motion was delayed at first by seconds, almost imperceptible, then by minutes, as if time itself had fractured, leaving a fracture in the rhythm of flesh and glass. The fog thickened, curling over faces and hands, dampening the hair, seeping into the folds of clothing, leaving a faint, metallic tang on the tongue. The air smelled of wet linen and smoke, of soot and candle wax, of something older still, a memory that belonged to the building itself, a memory that had waited for centuries in the beams and floorboards. Candle flames flickered despite the absence of wind, stretching upward then bowing as though drawn by the motion behind the glass, shadows swaying in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The house seemed alive, leaning closer, tilting slightly toward the mirrors, as if the beams themselves were listening, tilting in anticipation of gestures yet to be performed. Eyes traced the fog's motion, following shapes that were never entirely human, never entirely reflection. The mirrors shimmered, edges undulating with a soft, silent vibration, catching the flicker of candlelight and bending it into new angles that did not exist in the room. Every movement inside was answered by another movement outside the body, a silent echo that lagged behind by heartbeats, and then by hours, a slow, creeping mimicry that weighed on the spine, pressed against joints, lingered in the warmth of the hearth without actually touching it. A faint metallic whisper ran beneath the fog, subtle, almost inaudible, brushing against ears that strained in the quiet. No one dared leave the attic, though no lock could prevent it. The space seemed to hold its own gravity, an invisible pressure that pressed bodies toward the mirrors, toward alignment, toward repetition. The house exhaled in rhythm with the reflections, each breath of fog curling along the panels, pressing against skin and hair, filling the lungs and the space between walls. As candlelight began to dim, melting into the damp corners, the fog drew closer to faces, tracing eyes, brushing over lips, leaning into every contour, as if the mirrors themselves wished to memorize each feature, to press it into permanence. By the time dawn approached, though the first light of the frozen city of St. Petersburg had begun to pale the sky, the attic seemed to breathe on its own. Every mirror shimmered in silent anticipation, and for the first time, the living within the house felt the pull of something larger, something unseen, as if the mirrors had decided not merely to reflect, but to watch, to wait, and to teach a lesson written in fog and glass that would take lifetimes to understand. Night after night, the mirrors grew bolder, their patience stretching beyond seconds into the slow cruelty of minutes, then hours. Each reflection became a separate entity, aware, deliberate, moving with intent while the bodies that should have mirrored them remained stubbornly inert. A nod performed by a guest at dinner lingered behind in the glass long after the flesh had lowered its chin, the reflection repeating and exaggerating the gesture, tilting further, pressing the head into angles that the neck could never allow, tracing the curve of a jaw as if it could reshape bone. Servants, who had once carried trays and polished silver with routine care, found their hands moving alone, trembling when they reached for an empty glass, hovering midair while the mirrored hand traced its path behind them, hesitating, retreating, hesitating again. Wine sloshed quietly over the edges of crystal, yet no one spilled a drop on their own hand, and the puddle remained untouched on the tray, gleaming as though the liquid knew it had no place in the human world anymore. The fog thickened, pressing against the skin in cool, damp ribbons, sliding along forearms and necks, crawling beneath collars and cuffs, smelling faintly of iron and wet linen, of damp hearthwood long since extinguished, of smoke trapped behind walls and beams, something that had existed long before the house itself had been built. It was not a fog of weather but of intention, drawn from the mirrors themselves, heavy, suffocating, carrying the tang of metal and decay in its folds. Every candle in the attic flickered, as though threatened by invisible fingers brushing along wicks, their light quivering in place even as the wax melted steadily downward, pooling in soft globs that reflected distorted images of faces already half lost to the glass. Shadows moved independently, stretching and compressing across walls, bending along the beams, mingling with the fog in delicate spirals, creating shapes that were neither reflection nor substance, but something between, a suggestion of life that was both familiar and alien. Those who paused to look into a mirror found it impossible to focus on the surface, for it rippled subtly, like disturbed water, the edges bending, twisting, swallowing parts of the reflection, leaving gaps where the body should be, and yet showing motions that had not been performed. A hand reached for a candlestick. The mirror delayed, then raised its own hand with a tremor, shaking slightly as if uncertain, yet in the moment that the physical hand moved, the mirrored hand had already traced its path and returned, leaving an impression in the mind that lasted longer than the body's motion itself. The delay became addictive, suffocating, a rhythm that pressed on spines and lungs, an uneven heartbeat that the house seemed to borrow from the world outside and then stretch into something else entirely. The floors, polished with obsessive care, reflected the flickering light and fog in waves, creating duplicate hallways, twin staircases, phantom landings where no one could tread, and sometimes, if one moved too quickly, the reflection would linger in one place while the body passed beyond, leaving a ghostly double behind, standing still, staring. The smell became more insistent, metallic and faintly sweet, tangling with the smell of damp cloth and candle smoke, a taste that lingered in mouths even when lips were closed, a breath that pressed on nostrils, seeping into hair and clothing, embedding itself in memory like a warning. At times, when a body reached toward a glass or brushed hair from a face, the reflection anticipated it, the mirrored limb moving with a slow deliberation, tracing the air as if conducting a phantom symphony, its fingers shaking faintly, curling and uncurling in silent rhythm, as if performing a score that only the mirrors could hear. A tilt of the head or lift of the eyelid became a negotiation, an exchange between flesh and silver, the body struggling to catch up, trying to claim ownership of its motions, yet always falling behind, always losing a fraction of time, a fragment of self, to the patient, endless observing of glass. The attic seemed to inhale and exhale along with this rhythm, its beams creaking faintly in the damp air, the floorboards groaning as if acknowledging the strange autonomy of the mirrors, as if the house itself had become aware of the separation between reflection and flesh. Each mirror pulsed independently, a heartbeat out of sync with the body, the rhythm irregular, sometimes slowing to almost nothing, then snapping forward with sudden intent, forcing the eye to follow, the head to tilt, the muscles to tighten in anticipation of a motion already performed beyond comprehension. The living became attuned to the lag, learning it instinctively, moving in careful synchronization with the shadows and delays, their motions measured, cautious, as if a wrong tilt or misstep could shatter the fragile choreography. And yet, every night, the mirrors grew more elaborate, more demanding, layering gestures upon gestures, bending time with subtle cruelty, until the attic became a space where seconds and hours were meaningless, where the body existed only to echo what had already been done elsewhere, in glass, in fog, in anticipation. Hands that reached for objects hesitated, eyes followed movements not yet performed, lips parted in silent rehearsal, breathing synchronizing with the reflected pulse. Candles dripped wax that curved into impossible shapes, forming delicate towers and spirals that reflected and refracted the distorted images of faces, creating duplicates within duplicates, an endless nesting of human likenesses, each delayed by an invisible hand. The fog thickened further, pressing into clothing and hair, clinging to the breath and lungs, turning warmth into a cool pressure, a metallic brush against teeth and tongue, a taste that lingered longer than thought itself. The house seemed alive, patient, aware, its structure bending subtly to accommodate the slow, deliberate tyranny of glass and reflection. Floors tilted imperceptibly, beams shifted with the weight of attention, and shadows twisted in corners where no light could reach, all conspiring to remind the living that they were always second, always a heartbeat behind, always being measured against something older, something patient, something relentless. The mirrors did not simply reflect anymore. They commanded, anticipated, and recorded, leaving the attic thick with a presence that was felt in every joint, every nerve, every flicker of candlelight, every whisper of fog. Movement and reflection had become a conversation with no words, a negotiation of time itself, and the attic had become a cathedral of suspended seconds, of waiting, of anticipation, where human flesh existed only to fall into the rhythm already set, already observed, already claimed. By the seventh night, the house had begun to learn its own rules, as if the beams and floorboards had memorized a language older than human comprehension. Mirrors no longer waited for movement. They insinuated it, suggested it, pressed the suggestion into the mind before the body could resist. A guest in a velvet coat raised his hand in sleep, and the glass anticipated, lifting the hand first, trembling fingers tracing arcs and angles that had not yet been drawn by muscle or bone, calculating trajectories invisible to the eye. The fog responded, swirling faster now, coiling around ankles, wrists, and necks, pressing against skin through layers of wool and velvet, a damp weight that forced attention to the air itself. Candlelight quivered in the attic, flames bending toward the glass as if drawn by a force unseen, shadows stretching and twisting across walls, multiplying the reflections into impossible geometries. Every mirror shimmered at the edges, slight distortions bending the familiar into the unfamiliar, corners warping, surfaces rippling, as though the world beyond glass obeyed a different set of laws, an alternate gravity, a slow, deliberate cadence of anticipation. The air smelled metallic and faintly sweet, like iron left in warm water, mingled with damp linen and soot, pressing the lungs, thickening the chest, leaving a taste that lingered long after the breath was drawn. The house seemed to exhale with the mirrors, inhaling the fog, letting it curl through the beams, down the staircases, filling corners where the light never reached. Movement became negotiation, every gesture caught in an invisible web of anticipation, hesitation, and repetition. A maid adjusting a tray froze mid-step, and the reflection performed the motion first, bending slightly at the waist, tilting the head, brushing invisible hair aside, fingers trembling in careful precision, while the body lingered behind, waiting, unwilling, caught in the echo. Hands lifted, eyes blinked, lips formed silent words in mirrored anticipation, movements doubling, folding over themselves, creating a rhythm that was felt in the bones before it was seen by the eyes. The fog pressed against furniture, threading along carved edges, soaking into polished wood, brushing over carpet fibers, leaving the smell of wet iron embedded in every surface. Floorboards shifted almost imperceptibly, the house aligning itself with the reflections, leaning toward the glass, bowing slightly as if acknowledging its obedience, bending the space into corridors that did not exist, staircases that led nowhere, hallways stretching longer than architecture should allow. Guests began to move differently, bodies adjusting instinctively, caught in a subtle, unspoken choreography, limbs stiffening to match angles dictated by the mirrored suggestions. Chairs shifted by unseen hands, settling into positions aligned with shadows and reflections, the faint scrape of legs against floorboards echoing in time with the rhythm of the delayed movements. Each mirror pulsed independently, a heartbeat out of sync with the flesh, sometimes slowing to near stillness, then snapping forward, forcing muscles to contract in tiny increments, adjusting posture, holding breaths in sudden anticipation, tilting heads, squinting eyes, stretching fingers, a slow, insidious command that required no voice to enforce. The fog thickened further, brushing against hair and skin, cool and damp, heavy enough to be felt in every joint, pressing against ears, lungs, and throats, a presence that followed every movement, every hesitation, every attempt at control, leaving a metallic tang in mouths, a taste of iron and patience, a flavor that clung to the tongue and teeth. Shadows multiplied with the reflections, stretching over walls and ceilings, creating phantom limbs, doubling gestures, ghostly echoes of motions yet to come, bending the familiar into something alien, forcing the mind to follow paths it had not chosen. The mirrors remembered everything, storing angles, postures, gestures, building a catalog of anticipation, a library of delayed motion, a record of each flick of a finger, every tilt of a head, every lifted hand. The house itself seemed to pulse along with the glass, beams creaking in quiet acknowledgement, floorboards groaning softly as though aware that the living had become instruments, playing a music dictated by silver and fog. Each movement became increasingly precise, increasingly necessary. Hesitation was punished by the reflections advancing further, bending the air, warping space, creating distortions that demanded obedience without threat, a slow, inexorable pressure that pressed the living into shapes of their own making and yet entirely beyond their control. Candles dripped wax in delicate spirals, pooling into shapes that mirrored angles in the glass, light bending, reflecting, fracturing, creating further suggestions of movement, layers upon layers of expectation, each feeding the next, until bodies were no longer fully their own, shadows no longer fully human, and the fog itself seemed to guide, to press, to anticipate every breath, every blink, every twitch of a finger. The attic became a cathedral of anticipation, a space where mirrors dictated time and bodies obeyed, where fog and reflection conspired to bend flesh into rhythms older than memory, movements rehearsed without audience, gestures repeated without consent, until the very air felt weighted, thickened with expectation, pressing against every surface, every sinew, leaving a city of seconds trapped inside glass and mist. By the end of the seventh night, wealth and warmth had become irrelevant to the cold, deliberate authority of reflection, irrelevant to the precise, unrelenting choreography of fog and glass, irrelevant to the lesson the house had been waiting to teach. Every motion had been anticipated, every hesitation catalogued, every heartbeat delayed in perfect alignment with a pulse that belonged not to the flesh, but to the mirrors themselves, patient, relentless, inevitable, and entirely beyond the reach of the living. The attic had transformed into a theater of delayed life, a suspended stage where time obeyed the whim of glass and fog, where every gesture became both rehearsal and performance, stretching across minutes and hours with a weight that pressed upon bones and lungs. Figures moved in the mirrors before they moved in reality, tilting heads, folding hands, shifting weight with a patience that surpassed human comprehension, each reflection a master, each body a student caught in an endless lesson. A maid's folded hands in the glass trembled while her own remained still, caught in the tension between obedience and anticipation, a fraction of eternity stretching between mirrored motion and flesh, a space that felt as long as the attic itself, a gap that pulsed in rhythm with the fog and the creak of timber. The fog itself had become a participant, curling in slow spirals around arms and legs, brushing over collars and hair, moist and heavy with the scent of old wood, soot, and fear, filling the air with the taste of iron and damp linen, pressing against every pore and joint, suffusing the lungs with its damp insistence. Candles burned low, their flames bending and bowing as if in recognition of the invisible choreography, smoke twisting in spirals that reflected off the glass in ways impossible to trace, creating shadows that doubled, tripled, and multiplied upon themselves, stretching across the beams, crawling along the floorboards, climbing walls, until corners seemed to fold into impossible shapes, corners that should not exist, edges that had no right to meet, angles that contradicted reason. Every mirror whispered silently in movement, a language of posture and shadow, the voice of silver and fog more commanding than any human voice could ever be, more precise than any hand could measure, insisting on alignment, repetition, anticipation. Eyes tracked phantom gestures that preceded their owners, following angles and curves that the mind could not fully comprehend, creating a dizziness that pressed behind the skull and against the ribcage, a sensation that the body was unmoored, yet tethered to something unseen, something patient, something unrelenting. Every tilt of a head, every subtle shift of weight, every lifting of a hand was mirrored with a delay that lengthened as the night deepened, stretching seconds into minutes, minutes into hours, until the attic became a place where chronology had no meaning, where past, present, and future coexisted in the tremble of silver and the embrace of fog. The mirrors multiplied their intent, reflections bending subtly, edges shimmering, glass warping with an imperceptible ripple, creating impossible duplicates of figures, doubles that gestured slightly differently, tracing paths that the original body had not yet considered, creating layers upon layers of anticipation, each one heavier than the last, pressing into memory, into sinew, into breath. Feet that should have stepped forward hovered, paused by invisible insistence, following the mirrored rhythm, toes curling in tension, knees bending in calculated resistance, the body trapped in an obedience it could not name, a choreography dictated by glass, fog, and shadow, each second stretching longer than it had a right to. The smell of damp wood, soot, and iron intensified, rising from floorboards and staircases, pressing into hair, drifting into lungs, a presence as physical as the floor beneath them, as impossible to escape as gravity itself, reminding every living thing in the attic that the house had a will of its own, patient, deliberate, insistent. Candles burned low yet did not extinguish, flames bending toward reflections, casting light and shadow in impossible geometries, pooling against walls and floors in twisting shapes that seemed alive, watching, guiding, marking the rhythm of motion in the space between reality and glass. The mirrors did not merely reflect, they instructed, commanded, suggested motions before the body knew it would move, bending the air with their unspoken authority, stretching time into corridors of expectation, folding seconds upon seconds until even the mind struggled to keep pace. Shadows elongated, separated from their objects, following gestures with a delay, then anticipating, then diverging, creating doubles of doubles, phantom echoes of movements that may never be performed, a symphony of posture and shadow, all conducted by silvered glass and the damp, insistent fog. Every breath became synchronized, every heartbeat delayed, every blink measured against the pulse of reflection, until the living felt the attic itself beating in tandem with glass and shadow, a presence that pressed in through walls and floorboards, wrapping around spines, tracing sinews, insinuating itself into muscles and joints, leaving a weight that was neither alive nor dead, neither flesh nor air, yet felt in every sense. Furniture shifted subtly, chairs tilting, benches sliding, carpets rippling underfoot as if aware of the mirrored choreography, adjusting to the rhythm, echoing the anticipation of motion, reinforcing the lesson that bodies were secondary to reflections, that flesh was to be trained, rehearsed, refined by the patient insistence of silvered glass. The attic became a space where time and motion were dictated by anticipation, where fog and candlelight were instruments of instruction, where shadows were messengers, and every human inside was subject to the choreography of another existence. Hands that should have folded, heads that should have bowed, eyes that should have blinked, all performed first in glass, and then, reluctantly, obediently, in flesh, each act a delayed surrender, each motion a submission to the silent authority that filled the room. By the end of the night, when the first gray light of St. Petersburg's frozen dawn crept through the small attic window, the house exhaled, the fog curling into final spirals, the mirrors shimmering with satisfaction, and the living, exhausted and unknowing, found themselves caught between two realities, the one they inhabited and the one they had been forced to obey, bodies rehearsing the choreography of shadows, minds marked by the patient tyranny of glass, forever learning the language of posture, the lesson of reflection, the obedience of delay. By dawn on the 10th day, the attic had become a cathedral of frozen motion, a space where the delay between reflection and flesh had vanished, replaced by perfect, terrifying alignment. Every body stood in exact correspondence with its mirrored counterpart, heads tilted at the same angles, hands folded or extended in calculated gesture, eyes open and staring, lips parted in the faintest hint of a smile that was neither warmth nor joy, but the neutral expression of mimicry perfected. The fog lingered, curling in slow, insistent spirals around ankles and wrists, brushing against collars and necklines, leaving behind a metallic tang that coated teeth and tongue, pressed against lungs, settled in the hair and clothing, embedding itself in the senses like a warning that could not be ignored. Candles burned low along the attic floorboards, their flames leaning toward the mirrors, as if drawn by a force only they could sense, casting long, quivering shadows that multiplied the already impossible geometry of frozen limbs, creating phantoms within phantoms, duplicates within duplicates, reflections stacked like fragile layers of memory. The house exhaled slowly, a breath that was not measured by walls or windows, not dictated by rafters or beams, but by the subtle tyranny of glass, by the patient insistence of silvered surfaces that had learned to dictate time itself. Every movement of air, every creak of timber, every whisper of frost against window panes seemed to respond to the mirrors, as though the attic had become a living organism, its pulse synchronized to the frozen choreography of bodies and fog. Outside, the city of St. Petersburg awoke to the usual clatter of carriages, the sharp cry of merchants, the scraping of iron against cobblestone, unaware that within the mansion, life had surrendered completely, obeying a rhythm no longer dictated by thought, will, or habit. The windows, blackened by frost and shadow, reflected nothing of the rising sun, only the infinite repetition of figures that had ceased to be human in their autonomy, yet had not died. Their flesh remained warm to the touch, limbs supple, skin unblemished, but entirely governed by the mirrored law. Each mirror held dominion over its respective body, a quiet authority that pressed on muscle and sinew, guiding posture, expression, and breath with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, leaving no margin for deviation, no room for resistance. The fog threaded between the bodies, curling along fingers, weaving through hair, clinging to clothing, soaking into the fabric of coats and skirts, leaving a trace of damp iron, a whisper of decay, a reminder that the air itself had become a participant, an accomplice in the silent coup of reflection over life. The attic floor seemed to hum underfoot, a subtle vibration that corresponded to the collective alignment, a resonance that traveled up through legs and spine into the chest, embedding itself in bone, convincing every cell that still had autonomy that submission was inevitable, that resistance was no longer possible, that the mirrors had always known the path before the body could act. Furniture had arranged itself without hands, chairs sliding, tables tilting, benches nudged into precise positions that reinforced the geometry of motion, the choreography of delay now perfected into a static performance that required no rehearsal, no participation, only continued presence in the shapes dictated by silver and fog. The air smelled of cold iron, damp wood, and the faintly sweet tang of old fear, an odor that clung to the skin, threaded into hair, lingered beneath fingernails, a presence that reminded every observer, whether living or reflected, that the attic had become a space apart, governed by its own rules, its own chronology, its own inexorable authority. Every reflection was aware, patient, deliberate, its surface smooth and undisturbed, yet brimming with the energy of anticipation fulfilled, of gestures predicted and performed, of time consumed in obedience. The bodies themselves were both alive and no longer themselves, caught in a state of perpetual mimicry, a liminal existence between thought and reflection, between autonomy and subjugation, an extension of the mirror's will, a testament to their mastery. Candlelight pooled and fractured across the glass surfaces, bouncing in impossible angles, creating secondary reflections that multiplied the sense of infinitude, of depth that could not be measured, of a space where every gesture repeated endlessly into eternity, folding over itself in perfect symmetry, leaving no distinction between original and copy. The fog pressed against the walls and ceiling, thickening near beams and rafters, curling around corners, following the bodies with subtle insistence, moving as if it too had learned to obey the mirrors, to reinforce their authority, to hold the attic in a suspended state of vigilance. Time had ceased to flow in conventional measure. Minutes were meaningless, hours irrelevant. Only the rhythm of reflection persisted, a heartbeat out of sync with the living, yet absolute in its control, a law that no muscle, no nerve, no thought could contravene. Every breath taken by the frozen figures was measured, shallow, precise, a mimicry of life perfected into submission, every blink anticipated by silver before the eye could close, every movement of finger or toe preordained by the quiet tyranny of glass. The house itself seemed to lean inward, every beam, every floorboard, every corner pressing into the space, acknowledging the authority of its mirrors, bending subtly under the weight of their power, the attic alive with the triumph of reflection over autonomy. By the time the first rays of the sun, pale and cold, breached the horizon, the experiment had completed itself in every sense. Life, in its usual chaos, had been absorbed, measured, and perfected into static obedience. The house exhaled, the fog settled, the mirrors gleamed, and the figures remained as they had become, eyes open, lips parted, faces calm and distant, forever aligned, forever held hostage to the silent, meticulous dominion of glass. Weeks later, when the attic was finally entered, it felt smaller than memory allowed, its beams bowing slightly under the weight of silence. The mirrors hung like blank eyes, silvered surfaces untouched by fog, perfectly still, reflecting nothing but the empty air between them. Yet the bodies remained, upright, precise, frozen in the postures dictated by the glass, eyes fixed on spaces that did not exist, lips parted in that faint, knowing smile, a smile that belonged to another time, another will. The wealthy merchant had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with meticulous accounts of motion, records of gestures never performed, moments measured with the patience of glass, hours recorded that the world outside could not recognize or verify. Every entry detailed the rise and fall of hands, the tilt of heads, the subtle shifting of weight in the delay between reflection and flesh, as if the mirrors themselves had dictated a curriculum of obedience and had left the body to memorize it in perpetuity. The smell of iron and damp linen lingered faintly in corners, a ghost of fog that had long since evaporated, settling into the fibers of carpet and the cracks of floorboards, a reminder that the house had once breathed in tandem with silvered glass, had exhaled only when the last body had learned the language of mimicry. Candle holders remained in place, wax hardened in mid-drip, their small, curved shadows frozen against the walls, echoing the rigidity of human posture, echoing the perfection of reflection over autonomy. On the ledger's pages, a faint scratching moved across lines as if an unseen hand, invisible even to the careful observer, was still writing, still recording, noting infinitesimal corrections, deviations too slight to be perceived by the eye, but palpable in the aura of the attic, as if the mirrors had become a mind, cataloging, indexing, perfecting endlessly. Every figure in the room carried a memory of motion that no living witness could account for, limbs suspended in obedience to an authority no longer present, eyes staring into corners that contained neither light nor shadow, mouths forming the same pale hint of comprehension that could never be fully articulated. The house itself had retained the shape of the experiment, walls subtly bowing to accommodate the weight of anticipation, beams echoing the rhythm of delayed movements, floorboards whispering the cadence of gestures that had been rehearsed under the invisible command of glass. Outside, St. Petersburg carried on with indifferent bustle, carriages rolling over frozen streets, merchants calling, dogs barking, the Neva groaning under ice, unaware that the mansion had multiplied its inhabitants into a state of perpetual mimicry, that the lessons of reflection had escaped the bounds of its attic, stretching into the city itself. Shadows began to behave strangely in alleys, elongating to touch walls before the figures that cast them arrived, bending and twisting in impossible angles, gesturing slightly ahead of the world, repeating motions that had never been performed, creating a subtle sense of unease that no explanation could satisfy. Windows reflected these anomalies faintly, catching glimpses of bodies moving just out of sync with their own shadows, glimpses that lasted only an instant before the light shifted and the world corrected itself. Those who walked past the mansion reported feelings of being watched, of subtle corrections in their posture without conscious thought, an awareness that the city itself had absorbed the choreography of delay, that the invisible hand of the mirrors had not ceased but had expanded beyond the attic walls. Birds avoided the roofline for no discernible reason, circling wide, refusing to settle on the eaves, while rats vanished from the nearby alleys, leaving gnawed remnants of food undisturbed, as if the air itself had adopted the same rules of obedience, anticipation, and delay that had governed human bodies inside the house. On quiet nights, faint ripples seemed to pass across the glass of neighboring windows, reflections flickering slightly, capturing gestures that had never been performed, creating illusions of movement that unsettled the untrained eye, while the ledger remained open, its pages now moving of their own accord, ink forming loops and lines too precise for any hand, tracing shapes that belonged neither to letters nor to human gestures, recording the rhythm of a law that had escaped the bounds of the attic. The merchant's absence was felt less in his missing body than in the continuation of his work, in the persistence of the mirror's authority, in the subtle changes in the city's rhythm, where figures moved with the echoes of mirrored instruction in their posture, their glances, the timing of a step or a hand lifted. The attic, once a place of teaching and rehearsal, had become a repository of permanence, a chamber in which time itself had been twisted, folded, and aligned to the invisible will of glass and fog, leaving a trace on every soul that had ever crossed its threshold, a trace that spread slowly into streets, homes, and habits beyond the mansion's walls. Candlelight that flickered across the mirrors in the attic now seemed to hint at movement when none occurred, a faint shimmer, a pulse that suggested anticipation where none should exist, a rhythm that the city could not yet name but instinctively followed, a cadence of shadow and reflection that whispered of laws older than memory. The ledger scratched and recorded, unobserved yet meticulous, mapping not only bodies but the spaces they occupied, the minutes of hesitation, the alignment of limbs, the subtle curvatures of heads and shoulders, preserving a choreography that had long since departed from conscious awareness, leaving only its imprint on the living world outside. In the days that followed, residents passing the mansion would notice the faintest irregularities, a hand resting slightly differently, a head tilted an extra fraction of a degree, the timing of a blink just off from expectation, and those who had not entered the attic could not know why these deviations felt so familiar, so precise, so inevitable. The house had released nothing. It had multiplied, its lessons diffusing outward, carried by shadows, reflections, habits, and instinct, embedding itself in the city, leaving St. Petersburg subtly altered, a place where movement, posture, and the smallest gestures bore the invisible signature of a law imposed by glass, fog, and absence. By the time the Neva thawed enough to carry ice floes toward the Gulf of Finland, the mansion stood silent and empty in appearance, yet full in consequence, its mirrors reflecting only empty air, its bodies unmoving, its ledger inscribing the world beyond in invisible ink, and the city below moved with an awareness it could not name. A subtle dread threaded into the rhythm of steps, the alignment of shoulders, the pauses of breath, whispering that the house had not let go, that it had multiplied, and that its authority, quiet yet absolute, had seeped into the very fabric of life around it, forever unseen yet eternally present.